Okay, you've seen the title. Are Skyrim necromancers similar in any way to drug dealers? Weird question, I know, but it was the title of a blog post I found 10 years ago. The article itself was fairly straightforward and asking a logical question. Why would anyone ever become a necromancer? Being one is illegal, or at the very least, very highly unethical, dangerous, and forces you into complete societal isolation in some old dungeon in the woods. The usual cliché explanation for this phenomenon is that necromancy is a school of magic for the power hungry and immortality obsessed. But as the original article observes, most necromancers in Skyrim are poor nobodies, with cheap shoes and low tier gear, often killed off even by wild animals, not to mention the dragonborn. So what gives? Where are the rewards for your, presumably, long years of squalid living? The answer, according to the author, is the same as the one which explains modern day drug dealing, that there are no great rewards. Well, for the most part. The blog uses a chapter from the book Freakonomics to argue that essentially, both occupations are a gamble. By entering them, you become one of the many schmucks who are willing to work for next to nothing, or sometimes even pay for the privilege of getting a shot at getting to the top of the gang pyramid and becoming a drug lord, or an immortal lich, depending on whichever career you choose. Okay, cool, but why should I care about this obscure blog post analyzing a decade-old game? For me, the most interesting part of the blog post was that it tried to find normal, human motivations, or at least explanations, behind very cliched and uniquely fantasy lifestyle and profession choices, by linking fantasy and modern sociology. That was not something I was used to at the time, but I immediately grew fond of this approach. After all, if you can choose to roleplay as a necromancer in your game, shouldn't you have something more to go off of than another variation on the same power junkie? I'd say you should. But to do that, we will need to do a little bit more legwork than the blog post did. Because, well, drug dealing has a completely different job dynamic from necromancy. You don't hear that every day. First of all, the typical pyramid structure of a gang is not similar at all to that of a mage outcast coven. There are no clear treasurers, capos, or made men among wizards. There are stronger and weaker mages, sure, but the former don't seem to exploit or lord over the latter in any systemic way. Not to say that doesn't happen, it often does, at least in Skyrim. But it is not an essential part of the mage outcast experience. There are fantasy settings in which something more akin to a magical pyramid structure can be pointed to. And now some spoilers for the Black Magician trilogy incoming. In the Shruti Canavan series, a crucial plot lore element is the possibility of transferring and storing the magical energy of others through black magic, in contrast to just using one's own natural and continually recharging reservoir of energy. This makes the users of such dark arts exponentially more powerful, as they rely on those under them to supply them with magical ammunition, which can multiply a typical mage's natural capacity many times over. But since nothing like this exists in Skyrim, or in many other settings for that matter, we can only assume that if necromancers form a hierarchical structure, then it is based more on the typical master-pupil, or journeyman-apprentice relationship, which can hardly be called a true pyramid scheme, or a gamble, not only as it is the norm among medieval-esque professions like blacksmiths or stonemasons, but also because the absence of apprentices does not make their journeyman status disappear. They are still experts in their own right, while a leader of a drug cartel, or even a regular large business owner, ceases to be a boss, by definition, if everyone stops working for them for any reason. Also, in such a configuration, a pupil or apprentice continuously learns relevant skills of the trade, and not just supplies his or her labor for a wage, or at least usually. You can imagine a gang of mages which uses coercion to profit off of those lower in the ranks, but paradoxically, such a gang is much more likely to appear among socially accepted magic users, since escaping it would be much more difficult without leaving the comforts of large cities or high societies behind. To cut yourself off from a ruthless criminal organization often requires moving fairly far away, or even manufacturing a whole new identity for yourself to evade anyone trying to find you. This is much easier if the gang is already cut off from society and effectively relegated to a bandit camp in some small part of the woods. You can just leave and go to some other ruin or a dungeon, or even try to rejoin the law abiding townsfolk. It's not like the gang of necromancers can follow you in there without taking a huge risk. To go back to the point, the societal context in which both drug dealing and necromancing organizations operate is also completely different. As a dealer, you need to interact with normal people on a daily basis, supplying them with illicit goods while keeping a reasonably low profile. Enough people need to know who you are to buy from you and direct other people to you. But at the same time, you shouldn't be too open as to not put yourself in danger of being arrested. This leads to a seemingly paradoxical situation in which, although drug dealing is obviously not a socially respected job, Drug dealers are deeply integrated in their communities. They not only have obvious complicated relationships with their business associates, various local customers, family members, and strangers, but they are also usually the final part of a vast underground network of drivers, pilots, delivery coordinators, smugglers, packagers, plantation guards, chemists, and many others, not to mention the whole organized crime and government structures. In contrast, necromancy can basically operate as a solitary, freelance profession. A lone renegade mage, or at the very least, a small cabal of cultists relegated to a secluded fortress or dungeon, is the norm in the industry. Not many goods are produced, or consumed for that matter. The whole operation is usually mostly self contained, or uses up a free resource dead bodies, sometimes centuries old. Obviously, we can use magic as a substitute for large numbers of people and their labor. A single normal mage can easily perform tasks that would have required a whole group of workers simply by casting spells that split rocks, start fires, or melt iron. A mage who is also a necromancer or a summoner can even create slaves by tasking zombies and skeletons with simple orders, and effectively create his or her own organization, consisting mostly of animated dead bodies or summoned magical beings. But this is not what usually happens in fantasy. Necromancers are generally not in charge of anything near the scale of a large crime syndicate, and if they are, it is an undead army bent on destruction and conquest, not producing goods or providing services. And yeah, I know about the whole necrostates thing, like Warhammer's Vampire Counts or Tomb Kings, but those types of factions are not really a type of a small operation started by run-of-the-mill necromancer. Now that I think about it, the question of why magic is usually used to substitute simple labor, levitating a rock, starting a fire, but not for creating or aiding more complex societal processes, is a topic for another video. Back to drugs. I can already hear some of you say, but can't you just become a drug dealer and a drug producer? You wouldn't need anyone but your customers then. Just buy a van and cook meth in the desert, or even just plant weed in your garden. Wouldn't that work pretty much like necromancy? Not really. People were producing and using drugs since forever. Herodotus recorded Scythians as practitioners of weed hotboxing in the 5th century BCE, and hallucinogenic mushrooms, homemade moonshine, wine, or beer have been a staple of human diet since before recorded history. What caused drug dealing to take its current form was not the sole existence of mind altering substances, but the industrial scale production of said substances and its distribution by states, companies, and criminal organizations. This amounted to a situation in which vast supply created demand. Drugs like opium became much cheaper and much easier to obtain, and their distributors, regardless if they were British merchants or American drug companies, were doing all they could to hook up their clientele on their product, from providing free samples to making their product a prescription medicine. Biggest drug operations were and are run, or at least enabled, by modern governments and their intermediaries. Historically, the British Empire was known to be the crucial facilitator of early international drug running. Currently, it's the US government, not to mention various narco regime suppliers, from previous nationalist governments of China and Vietnam before their overthrow by the communists, through Afghanistan warlords to Colombia today. Of course, many governments which internationally dealt drugs internally enforced a policy of limiting drug consumption, at least to some extent, or at just mandating who exactly can sell what drugs to whom. Thus, a modern small-time drug producer operates in a reality shaped by the prior large-scale creation of a mass market for their illegal substance, not to mention a rise of the consumer economy fueled by expendable income that only became widespread after the Industrial Revolution, and even then only in some select regions of the world. So you may look at the local weed grower and dealer and see just a regular person selling something illegal, but in reality, the entire existence of their profession in its current form is predicated on powerful organized crime networks, companies, and modern government agencies, both present and past, supplying or containing them, or at the very least, creating a market for the product of their side hustle. But back to necromancers. If they are not like drug dealers, because they are not really integrated in society, nor does their profession require any substantial industrial and organizational backing, do they have nothing in common with each other? They have. Both groups are what you could call social deviants. And this is where the original blog post loses me completely. It poses that the central motivation for drug dealing is the hope of striking it big, that the street dealer hopes to become a drug lord in a similar way to a necromancer hoping to one day become a lich and attain immortality. Very few will succeed in either of these endeavors, but boy will they try. However, this is simply not a good explanation. Most people engaging in socially frowned upon behavior are not illegal startup owners, just gunning after forbidden lucrative opportunities and simply failing because of their own stupidity or because crime doesn't pay. The majority of people who deal drugs do it to supplement their, otherwise quite low, income. This is why, famously and contrary to their edgy image, many drug dealers live with their parents well into adulthood, as they simply lack the means to rent or own their own home. This is brought up both in the blog post and in the source book, Freakonomics, but in both cases it's not given enough weight as an argument. The drive to simply become rich may motivate some as an abstract long-term aspiration, but day-to-day, immediate goals will take precedence, from the need for security and acquiring basic goods, through group loyalty to desperation and lack of any other alternatives. Therefore, it would be much more helpful to look at drug dealers and necromancers as people who, on average, would turn to their respective professions either through the lack of legitimate sources of income, or as people who became deviant after prolonged periods of dismal, chaotic circumstances which weakened the social controls, stopping them from partaking in the socially frowned upon behavior. Civil War, anybody? Or at least, as long as we're talking about lower class necromancers, i.e., guys and gals in cheap shoes running around the woods getting mauled by rats and wolves. The better off middle and upper class necromancers may be more passion and career driven, but they are not the typical necromancers you encounter. So where does all this lead us? What exactly are necros in Skyrim from a sociological standpoint? To what real-world profession could they be likened? We will cover all that and a small Skyrim conspiracy of my own in the next video.
Necromancy, as any other type of magic, is a tool to be used. Of course, non-mages may not see it that way, so we don't go around flaunting it.